Okay, it's 2 o'clock. I'm starting on the dot because, frankly, my guest and I could talk most of the afternoon. That guest is Sergey Radchenko, a British-Russian historian. You could call yourself a British-American Russian historian in a way.
It's a very complex identity.
It's a complex identity. Anyway, a complex identity historian who is currently the distinguished professor at the Henry Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at Johns Hopkins. Professor Radchenko grew up at the tail end of the Soviet Union on Sakhalin Island in the far east of the country. His most recent book, To Run the World, is an exhaustive and utterly absorbing study of the foreign policy and foreign policy aims of successive Soviet leaders and leaderships in the post-war period through the entire Cold War, beginning, of course, with Joseph Stalin. The book won the prestigious Lionel Gelber Prize in Canada this year, and let me assure the audience, as somebody who's been on the shortlist twice but never won it, I am very envious because the Gelber Prize is basically as good as it gets. Sergey, welcome to the Vienna Humanities Festival.
Thank you for having me.
So in the second half of our conversation, as I said, we've got a lot to get through. I'm going to touch upon events since 2022 and the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. But I want to start with the motivation of Soviet and Russian leaders in fashioning their foreign policy, and of course, I think we have to start with Stalin. Now, you argue in the book that at the end of the Cold War, Stalin had no particular plans to impose communism on Eastern Europe. Ideology, it seems, played only a minor role in his thinking. So what was he thinking?
That's a very, very good question. So if you go back to 1945, the Soviets were triumphant after a very difficult war, which they almost lost, and they felt entitled to a place of prominence in Europe. There was a commission or a series of commissions at the Soviet Foreign Ministry that worked on the question of post-war settlement in 1944-45, and they planned out their vision of the post-war order. Key elements of this, the Soviets basically would run unopposed in Europe. So they had the Maxim Litvinov, who was the former foreign commissar, was one in charge of one of these commissions, actually proposed to Stalin that the Soviet sphere of influence should obviously include Eastern Europe, obviously, right? But then go as far as Sweden on one end, as far as Turkey on the other end. They also wanted a colony in Africa, which just shows the extent of their ambition. Now, the British, of course, were the other great power in Europe, according to the Soviet thinking, but they would balance offshore. They would not be so important. But what about the Americans? The idea, of course, the Americans would go back home as this is what happened after the First World War. Stalin expected the same thing to repeat itself, so the Americans would go back to North America. They would have their own sphere of influence, which is the American continent, and not bother about Europe. This was the kind of vision that Stalin had in mind, the world divided into spheres of influence, and he actually expected that the Americans would cooperate with him on this. Hence, you had the conference in Yalta and the general agreement between the leaders present there about the shape of the post-war order. And what struck me is just how long Stalin stuck by this idea that you could have some sort of a collaborative or cooperative relationship between great powers. And he, in some respects, he also was willing to respect the other side's spheres of influence. Most prominently, of course, the British with the percentages agreement in the Balkans. This was a very important area where he was willing to make some concessions. And then things fell apart, or began to fall apart from sort of 46, 47, and he increasingly realized that he would have to impose communist control, at least on the areas that the Soviet forces were in possession of.
And that falling apart was because he realized that the Americans did not intend to leave Europe.
Exactly, this was the big surprise. And this is the interesting thing. If you go back to 1945, you go to the Yalta Conference, you look at Stalin, you have Churchill, and obviously Roosevelt. It's the Americans who were the odd ones out, because Churchill was like Stalin. He was a 19th century imperialist. Of course, he thought in imperialistic terms. Yeah, we'll divide the Balkans, you'll get, 90%. In Bulgaria, we get 10%, we get 90%, in Greece, you get 10%, and so on and so forth. An easy way of doing it, right? And then come the Americans and say, well, this is not, we don't understand this, right? And so one of the things that was quite a big surprise, unpleasant surprise for Stalin, and that's already after FDR's death, the Americans refused to recognize the Soviet-imposed governments in Bulgaria and Romania. If you're Stalin, like, excuse me, where's Bulgaria and Romania? Where's the United States? What do you think you're doing? And so this is the kind of thinking that prevailed in the Kremlin at that time. So of course Stalin was very unhappy about what happened.
Now, it's during the Potsdam Conference in 1945 that Truman learns that the atom bomb is ready to go. How important was the atom bomb in shaping Stalin's thinking over the next 5 to 10 years?
It was huge. It was the elephant in the room. It was enormous. Of course, the Soviets knew about the Manhattan Project through their spies, including some that were imported by Britain, people like Klaus Fuchs, who formerly was a German refugee, ended up with the British Atomic Project, ultimately with the Manhattan Project. And so they, spies like Klaus Fuchs would pass the information over to the Soviets. Stalin knew that it was coming. He didn't realize how effective it would be. In fact, interesting, here's a fun fact. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviets immediately sent a team to those cities to investigate what happened. And the team wrote up a report where they interviewed the victims. It's actually quite horrid. You read it, it's quite unbelievable. But they concluded that actually it wasn't so bad. The destruction was not so bad. So that was
wow.
This was the because some structures remained standing. They said, oh well, it's survivable. From Stalin's perspective, though, this was not about how powerful the bomb was. It was whether the Soviet Union had the bomb or not. Because if you have the bomb, you have the political confidence to basically pursue your interests. If you don't, then you don't have that. And of course, Stalin did not have the bomb. On August 20th, 1945, the Soviets launched they launched their atomic project before that already in 1943. But by 1945, they really prioritized it, and it becomes project number one for the Soviet Union. Everything was directed towards it. But here's the interesting thing. When you have the London Conference of Foreign Ministers in 1945, Molotov goes to that London Conference of Foreign Ministers. Stalin sends him telegrams from his dacha in Sochi, saying, look, if they, whatever, don't make any concessions to the Allies, whatever they demand, no concessions whatsoever, because in Stalin's mind, if you make just a little, step of, or concede a little bit on something, the Americans will conclude that this is because they had all the cards, including the atomic bomb, and they will increase the pressure. So already you have the Soviet response response to the to American, what you would call, I guess, atomic diplomacy by really staging this show of complete defiance and refusal to make any concessions on anything.
Now, you argue that what Stalin was looking for was not so much ideological goals or even territorial goals, but legitimacy. What do you mean by legitimacy?
Well, like ideology, legitimacy is one of those cans of war, a can of worms. You start discussing it. I mean, one of the reasons that we have this debates among historians is we cannot agree on terms. So everybody has their own definition of ideology, everybody has their own definition of legitimacy, and they start arguing, and it seems like they have a disagreement, but actually they just don't, they speak at a different wavelength. So for me, legitimacy is important because in the book, I argue that the Soviets, for them, I actually deploy a kind of a parallel with Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. They say, well, the Soviet Union had a hierarchy of needs, so to speak, and one was security. Security was very important to them. They wanted to be secure, and Stalin interpreted security in terms of territory that he could control so as to stop oncoming onslaught from the enemy. That's before the nuclear age, right? So he had security. This was very important to him. But the second thing that he wanted was a sense of legitimacy, i.e. the sense that you're entitled to what you have, and it's not just because you say you're entitled, but because the others recognize that you're entitled to this, which is why the Yalta Conference was so important to him, because for him it entailed American recognition of what he saw as legitimate Soviet sphere of influence.
Okay, now generally in our rather Eurocentric way, we tend to we look at Soviet policy post-45 in terms of Eastern Europe in particular and the emerging Atlantic alliance. But what significance did Stalin place on relationships in East Asia, especially Japan, Korea, and China?
Well, and this is another aspect of the book, I do prioritize China in a way that I think other historians of the Cold War have not done, and that's despite the fact that if you see the book, it's got a big St. Basil's Cathedral on it. Everything is red as it should be. Of course, a book about Russia, but no, China is a big part of it. Why? Because I found that from Stalin onwards, and actually maybe with Stalin to a lesser extent than with later Soviet leaders, China was a huge thing for them. They always made their foreign policy with an eye to what the Chinese were thinking about it. Now, for Stalin, it's a little more nuanced here, because what's happening is China is obviously a weak actor in 1945. On paper, it's a great power. In reality, it's not such a great power. But he was interested in securing Soviet, bases there. He wanted a security belt like he had in Europe. He wanted Mongolia to remain in the Soviet sphere of influence, and he thought that he got some of those things through the Yalta Agreement, and then he negotiated with the Kuomintang Chinese government, the one that preceded the communists, in order to basically assure that the Soviets would have very much imperial gains, like what the Tsarist Russia had there, except this time those would be recognized by the United States. And what's interesting for me in that is just how much he was willing to give to arrive at that recognition and this gains. For example, he was in 1943-44, the Soviets, and 45, the Soviets sponsored a independence movement in Xinjiang, Eastern Turkestan. They were supporting the Uyghurs to proclaim their independence effectively, or to fight against the Chinese, and this was very successful. He basically betrayed those guys. He said, okay, we'll sell them out, and the so-called Eastern Turkestan movement came to a very, very abrupt end. Why? Because he wanted a cooperative relationship with the Chinese government, and he was willing to give certain things, like, for example, not annex Xinjiang, as he may have originally intended. Another thing that he was willing to give was to force his client in China, which was Mao Zedong, who was holed up in a place called Yan'an at that time, right, in the caves of Yan'an. He was trying to force Mao Zedong in 1945 to go and enter into coalition government with the Chinese nationalist government, right, with the Kuomintang. Mao Zedong said, well, this is crazy, because he received a telegram from Stalin saying, go to Chongqing, which was the wartime capital of China, negotiate with Chiang Kai-shek. He had to go. But he thought that it was a crazy idea. So Stalin was willing to make certain concessions in order to have this fairly good relationship with nationalist China, as long as his what he perceived as legitimate security goals were properly addressed and recognized.
So in 49 we have the Chinese Revolution, so we now have communist power from Western Russia through to Eastern China. Massive. This changes the map of the globe. But in 53, Stalin dies. I'm moving this on quite swiftly, but trying to have a coherent thread here. 56 turns out to be quite a year. the Western foreign policy, of course, has the Suez fiasco. And in the communist world, it kicks off with the secret speech, the 20th Party Congress. What were the sort of midterm consequences for Soviet foreign policy and Soviet international relations of the secret speech?
Well, it caused a gigantic shock in the international communist movement because you had communist parties in Western Europe that worshipped Stalin and that refused to recognize that Stalin could make any mistakes. And suddenly the Soviets themselves, i.e. the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, goes out there, makes a secret speech, but of course it's leaked almost immediately, and people read it, and those communist parties and the leaders of those communist parties have to explain that actually, Stalin was not the greatest person who ever lived, but actually was a murderous criminal, as Khrushchev effectively described him. And so that creates a crisis of legitimacy, speaking of legitimacy, for Western communist parties, which is of course then further worsened and deepened by the Soviet intervention in Hungary in 1956. So Western communist parties really, some of them practically fall apart after that. For other countries, and I talk about, in the book I talk about Poland, I talk about Hungary, that those are well-known crises, but I also talk about China and the impact on China of 1956. Now, Mao and Stalin did not like each other, or in particular, I would say Mao did not like Stalin. He really hated Stalin, right? Stalin mistreated him. He went to Moscow in 1949, 1950. They signed the Treaty of Alliance, but it was not a pleasant experience for Mao at all, right? So he complained about Stalin all the time. But he would say Stalin was a great Marxist-Leninist and his mistakes were only 30%. Or, as he would say, out of Stalin's fingers, only 3 fingers were rotten, but 7 fingers were good fingers. And the 3 fingers that were rotten was, of course, Stalin's attitude towards China, because Mao thought that this was, extremely bad. And what really Mao was unhappy about was that Khrushchev, without consulting him, basically denounced Stalin and created what Mao perceived as a crisis in the international communist movement. So what Mao did in response was to assert China's view and to almost place China into this position of strategic leadership, basically trying to tell Khrushchev what you should do. You didn't do it correctly, we'll do it in a different way. So we'll still respect Stalin and so on. And so you could argue that 1956 is an important turning point as well for this for Beijing's relationship with Moscow, because Beijing tries then to establish itself as a separate center of authority in the communist world, and very soon after that things really fall apart, and by 1959 they're quarreling, they're allies, right, but they're quarreling. By 1969 they have a war. They actually fight a war, a border war at Damansky/Chenbaodao.
So this is a paradoxal period, the late 50s, because you have this brewing dispute within the communist world, and indeed it's over who leads the communist world to a degree as well, with China developing aspirations. But at the same time, Sputnik has been launched, and Soviet prestige around the world is actually growing, and when Khrushchev claims that he's going to beat the United States at their own game, as it were, people actually sat up and listened. So there are 2 things going on here.
For a while, right? Because, okay, Sputnik redeemed the Soviet Union, because in 1956, if you have to use tanks to prove to people how wonderful communism is, which is what they did in Budapest, this system has no future. But then in '57 they launched Sputnik. You have the launch of Gagarin, obviously, in April '61. And Khrushchev has this wonderful visions about building communism within 20 years, which, by the way, was one reason why he so resented those Chinese attacks against his leadership of the communist world, because he was saying, well, look, we had the Bolshevik revolution, communist revolution, we defeated, quote unquote, defeated Nazi Germany. We launched the Sputnik into space. What did China do? How is it, why is it claiming leadership? So he was quite upset about it, and thought that the Chinese were just, chauvinistic, et cetera, et cetera. But then what happens is that this vision of rosy Soviet future, the rosy vision of the Soviet future, starts to fall apart. I think it starts to fall apart already on Khrushchev's watch. You have serious harvest failures. The Soviets already have in 1962, the same year they sent missiles to Cuba. What's another thing that happens in 1962? They have effectively food riots because Khrushchev raises prices, and there are riots in Novocherkassk, and he has to use the police and on the army to suppress the uprising. Then they have to import grain for the first time in massive amounts of grain, spending huge amount of gold reserves on that. So that's the early 60s. By the late 60s, they realized that this vision of great Soviet modernity is simply unattainable.
Moving on quite swiftly to the 1980s, what role does Eastern Europe play in the weakening of Soviet power, and why?
So that's a complicated question. I think and this is where I will open another can of worms. So there is this vision. It depends on who you talk to. If you go now, to the United States and talk to anybody from the Republican Party, they will say, Reagan won the Cold War, and that's it. I think a more nuanced position would have it that Gorbachev, as a man from the 1960s, was averse to the use of force, was more, pro-democracy, and so on and so forth. That that Soviet dissidents played a big role in basically shaping the kind of narratives that led to the end of the Cold War. I would take almost a Marxist view on this, i.e. that it's the economy is stupid. What we have in the 1970s is, as I mentioned, the Soviets already recognized by the late 1960s that their economy is going to hell. But they get reprieve to a certain extent by the fact that you have an oil crisis and they're able to export oil and gas. Now, the reprieve that they get is not enough. They do not become a Saudi Arabia effectively. That's because their internal requirements, fuel requirements, are still very high, and they just get barely enough extra to export and to support Eastern Europe. And so by the 1970s, you have first you've got effectively debt crisis in Eastern Europe, and that becomes especially a big problem for Poland by the late 1970s, early 1980s. And so the Soviets struggle because they have to sustain those regimes. I think it was Khrushchev who recognized this dilemma, because when Stalin was in control of Eastern Europe, what did Stalin do? He basically just extracted resources from Eastern Europe. Just basically took anything that moved, and took it to the Soviet Union. When Khrushchev comes around, he recognizes that you cannot do this, because if you keep doing this, then you'll have 1956 repeated all over again, right? You cannot do that. So you have to somehow support them. And the support was in the form of oil and gas. And it becomes highly subsidized. And so it keeps going there. But then the Soviets recognized that this is just not a model that could be sustained indefinitely. And when we get to mid-1980s, first of all, you've got the collapse of oil prices by 1986, which causes huge problems for the Soviet Union. The Soviets are trying to launch their own reforms, and the Soviets also develop a debt problem. Their debt multiplies significantly by 1987, 88. And so then you have Gorbachev discussing this problem at the Politburo, where he says, look, we just have to let them go, because if we don't, what happens if we intervene? Then who will feed them, meaning Eastern Europe? Who will sustain them? We cannot do that. We can no longer afford. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but this is what Gorbachev was saying. So to me, I think Gorbachev, to me, he showed distinct signs of realism. He understood the limitations of Soviet economy. He understood that the Soviet Union was vastly overextended, and that helps explain why the Soviets pulled out.
So, I remember I covered the 27th Party Congress in March 1986, and what struck me was actually for New Scientist magazine, which is relevant to this, because what struck me was that Gorbachev's speech was actually slightly less important than Nikolai Ryzhkov's speech, because Ryzhkov spells out exactly what the problem is in terms of technology and the widening gap with the United States. And remarkably in your book, and this stuck out to me like my eyes popped out of my head when I read this. You write, as early as 1968, the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, sent Brezhnev a prophetic memorandum criticizing low labor efficiency, wastefulness, oversupply of money, and especially the inability to keep up with the United States in research and development, education, and the use of computers, which is what Ryzhkov specifically says. And then you quote Andropov. We are talking here about the factors that will determine the face of the world in 15 to 20 years, and it is therefore important here not to overlook something substantial, pleaded Andropov. Brezhnev locked the memorandum in his desk, where it was discovered after his death in 1982.
Sad story.
then this happens in spades in the 1980s. All of a sudden, the United States has 1 million personal computers. The Soviet Union has 10,000. And this, of course, also impacts on the military, and in particular missile systems and the use of microprocessors in missile systems. So really, Gorbachev and Khrushchev, although they subsequently sort of fall out quite badly, they understood that the writing was on the wall, and it's very difficult to see how you're going to avoid it without...
And just to redeem Reagan, because I criticized this view that Reagan, that Reagan won the Cold War, you do have this moment after Gorbachev already comes to power, right, in March 1985, where Gorbachev basically says, look, if the Americans impose another round of arms race on us, we're going to lose. He recognizes that because he understands that the Soviet economy, Soviet technology, etc., they're just not up to the same standard.
Yeah. So, quickly, it's a big question, why does communism collapse in the Soviet Union and why does it survive in China?
I think, again, it's a question of legitimacy. You have a deal that the Soviet government is trying to make with the Soviet people. That is, you improve the quality of life. What is the basis of legitimacy? The basis of legitimacy, well, there could be different basis of legitimacy. First, you got to have an external basis, i.e. you're recognized by various countries that you're a great power. You can also have an internal basis, i.e. you actually deliver for your people and they're recognized that this is a good government, and so they keep supporting your government, right? So this internal basis of legitimacy started to really erode significantly by the early 1960s, simply because the economy was not delivering. That is why, by the way, the Soviets reverted to the trappings of external glory, and they sought, like Brezhnev did, détente with the United States, recognition of the Soviet greatness, the Helsinki process. All of that was supposed to give legitimacy externally when you did not have internal legitimacy. And yet, this proved in the end simply it was not enough, and so in the end the regime obviously crumbled. So economics, I think, decided a lot here, whereas in China's case it was somewhat different. Mao Zedong with this idea of both internal revolution and externally returning China to centrality, because China had suffered quote-unquote century of humiliation. Therefore, now we, the Chinese people, have stood up, as Mao Zedong said in 1949, and we will do something about kind of returning China to its former glory. And now, internal revolution was supposed to serve that aim, by the way. So when Mao Zedong launches the Great Leap Forward, which was obviously a horrible experiment which led to the death of tens of millions of people, what was the purpose of this? The purpose of this was to modernize China so that it can leapfrog the Soviet Union into this communist modernity and be this super great power. Did not work out, right? And then Mao was like, oh, something is not working, so maybe it's everybody in the party leadership sold out, and therefore he has the Cultural Revolution to purify the ranks. When Mao Zedong dies, already even before he dies, you get to the early 1970s, there's already recognition that you have to modernize in a different way, and so there's a turn towards the West, and Zhou Enlai, already at that time, the Prime Minister of China, launches effectively the four modernizations, which is, modernize different aspects of Chinese economy and defense. And then this continues in the late 1970s. Deng Xiaoping effectively puts aside this whole idea of returning China to centrality, prioritizes economics, and decides that you could perhaps, if you do that, if you build up the foundation, then everything else will come with it. So he does it the opposite way from the Soviets. The Soviets always prioritize external greatness. The Chinese prioritize internal development under Deng Xiaoping, right? Under Mao, they also prioritize external greatness. Under Deng Xiaoping, they said, no, we will develop our economy. And so we have the Dao Guang Yang Hui moment where, you know, it's the Chinese, how do you translate this? Keep a low profile policy for a number of decades, which survives until Xi Jinping, and of course now we're seeing something else in China.
How does your understanding of Soviet foreign policy, moving on to Putin now, how do you think it's impacted on Putin's foreign policy development?
Well, I think there is a continuity. We thought that the Cold War was something so exceptional. Here comes 1989, Germany is reunified, Eastern Europe is liberated, we're living in this new wonderful moment, and everything is supposed to be different. But then the question arises, if everything was supposed to be so different, then why did everything turn out to be just the same? And I think the answer to this question is that there are continuities from the Soviet period to Russian period. And if I were to pinpoint one particular continuity, it's this quest for recognition, quest for greatness, because the Russians don't, they don't want anything quite as much as the sense of being recognized as a great power. They will go hungry to be recognized as a great power. Why is this? I never could understand that. I don't understand why you would prioritize some kind of trappings of glory and external greatness at the expense of the quality of life of your people. But this is what happens in the Soviet Union. This is what happens in Russia as well. So I would say that there's this continuity that centers on the Russia's alleged role as one of the great powers of the world, and on the Russian people articulated desire to be seen as this great power.
But really, I mean, Russia's great power status after 1989 is, after 91, is basically dependent on its possession of 5,000 nuclear warheads. Absent those nuclear warheads.
That's right.
What have we got?
Also before. I mean, think about the Soviet economy and the Soviet military. By the 1970s, you have a Soviet military-industrial complex and a Soviet nuclear might that rivals the United States. When Brezhnev engages with Nixon on détente, this is what he is stressing. We are great powers. Why? Because we can destroy the world. And so on this basis, we can run the world together. This is, by the way, the title of my book, To Run the World. This is something that happens. In 1973, Kissinger goes to Moscow, and Brezhnev takes him to this dacha outside of Moscow, where they hunt wild pigs, and they climb into this tower, waiting for pigs. And then Brezhnev tells Kissinger, I'll have to tell you something. Here's what we're going to do. We, meaning the United States and the Soviet Union, we are going to run the world together. Not by ourselves, together. And this, Kissinger then delivers this message to Richard Nixon, who's not buying this, by the way. Right. So yeah.
So one of the paradoxes of Russia as a great power, with or without nuclear warheads, is that it has never been able to free itself of technological dependency from this or that power. It always has to buy it in.
It's crazy, isn't it? And this is interesting. Once there's this view that the Soviet Union was an autarkic power and that existed almost separately from world economy. This is so not true. If you look at how much the Soviet Union depended on Western technologies, it's incredible. Whole industries were built in the Soviet Union on the basis of Western technologies. And then if you look at the 1970s, the big German-Soviet deals like gas, for example, what did the Soviet Union want? They wanted pipes, because they didn't have them. They said, okay, we'll export your gas, but we need technology. We need pipes, and pipes is not such a very important technology, but they still didn't have it. So they wanted pipes, and they wanted compressors, and other things like that. So the Soviet Union actually was profoundly built into the world economy, very, very much so.
And of course, I mean, one of the motivations today from switching from the West to China is because China can act as a substitute in terms of delivering technologies.
And it has, it has. It's, I was recently, well, a few months ago, there was an article, I want to say in Kommersant, one of the Russian newspapers, where they discussed the Russian car market. And they said they had a list of top 10 car manufacturers in Russia by the numbers of cars. You know, I looked at it, I never heard of these things. You know, there are cars that you never heard about. They're all Chinese cars, right?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, they've taken that market already. Let's jump to the current situation, 3.5 years into the Russia-Ukrainian war. And this morning, to some surprise, Yuval Harari wrote an op-ed in the FT arguing that Ukraine is winning the war. Do you agree?
Well, I think we'd have to wait until the final results. You know, it's one of those things where the proof is in the pudding. If they're winning the war, then we need to see the results. Unfortunately, what's happening is you know, the war has been obviously a quagmire, but gradually the Russians are making gains in the eastern parts of Ukraine. Obviously, not at the kind of rate that they expected. Ukraine faces significant difficulties, including difficulty of manpower, but also difficulty of just paying for the war. They're having a budget deficit because the war is so expensive. I mean, fundamentally, it is a quagmire for both sides. I'm not going to say that Russia is. If it went well for Russia, then they would have won it, right? The fact that they're 3.5 years into it, they're still struggling to gain a few kilometers here and there in eastern Donbass suggests that perhaps they're not as powerful, or as President Trump recently said, something of a paper tiger, by the way, which was a Mao Zedong's expression. So you know, no, I don't think Ukraine is winning. I don't think so.
Now, you've written more authoritatively than anyone that I know of on the early attempts of finding a negotiated peace to the war soon after it started. Is it true that some Western leaders, notably Boris Johnson, persuaded President Zelensky not to do a deal with a promise that NATO would give Kyiv a full backing?
No, I don't think it's true. And of course, you're referring to the article that I co-wrote with Sam Cherub last year on the Istanbul peace talks, where it was actually remarkable because we got access to these documents to just understand what was going on. And you know, you had several of these drafts that you could go through, and you could see how positions changed and what the Russians wanted, what the Ukrainians wanted, and so, you know, I can go into this and explain their various positions. But then the negotiations came to effectively to a halt in April of 2022, and the question is what happened. And of course, the Russian propaganda has it that Boris Johnson came to Kyiv and said, "Well, you just keep fighting." I don't think this is the reason. What happened really was that the Ukrainians understood that after the Russians lost the battle for Kyiv, they understood that this war could be potentially won on the battlefield. And if this were the case, then they did not have to accept the pretty punishing terms that the Russians were trying to impose on them at Istanbul, which included things like demilitarization of Ukraine. Now, there were still a lot of disagreement on what this so-called demilitarization would mean. They could not agree on the numbers of troops, on the types of weapons that Ukraine would be allowed to have. And there were other disagreements, but they did manage to arrive at some kind of a joint document, more or less. And then they realized, the Ukrainians realized that the Russians could be defeated, which is of course what happened near Kyiv, and hence they continued fighting. Do I blame them? No.
Right. So before I throw it over to the audience, I've got one question about the book. I was astonished by the sources you managed to get. And when I say the sources, I'm talking about the personal responses of members of the Soviet leadership to all manner of events, because up until now, these characters in the Soviet Politburo have been sort of rather dour figures who, who never inspire in any way. But you managed to bring them all to life by extracting their thoughts from little scraps of paper and things like that. How did you go about getting all this information, given the, the situation of the archives in Russia?
So it's dangerous to ask historians about sources, because that could go for a long time. I should just say that I was living in China at the time that I started this book. And I had a wonderful time in China. I had really, really good access before Comrade Xi Jinping rolled in and everything was blocked. And actually, this book was supposed to be a book about China first when I envisioned it, because I had such great access in China. I was getting, wonderful materials. And then something happened in Russia, which is suddenly in the early 2010s, so about 2013, 2014, they opened up huge amount of documents, including personal papers of people like Nikita Khrushchev, Leonid Brezhnev. You could actually go there and read what what they were saying to each other, what they were saying to various foreign visitors. In Khrushchev's case, it's hilarious because Khrushchev had a propensity to ramble, like I also do, but he had, unlike me, he had stenographers who would take down every word, and so you have Khrushchev's ramblings, on paper, and so you can, by analyze, it's almost you become a psychoanalyst of some kind. You read it and you think, okay, I can see what kind of people they were. For the first time, they're not just figures out there on the Olympus of, great Soviet power. These are just normal people. And you can understand their motivations, their fears, their delusions, their ambitions, it's all there. So I was just very fortunate that they opened the archives. A lot of people think, by the way, that Russia, under Putin's authoritarian
I thought they closed everything down, I must admit.
It's crazy. They opened the archives. I'll tell you, one of the craziest things for me was that, among other things, the Russian Ministry of Defense in the spring of 2022 declassified hundreds of pages of documents on the Cuban Missile Crisis. And you would think, well, that's clearly they have other things to do. This is spring of 2022, and yet they're declassifying this document. And I don't know how to explain this, but I would not say that the story is all great and wonderful, because you do have now, there was a period where you could actually see a lot of stuff, and now it's becoming much more difficult, not least just to travel there. And I would not recommend, any researchers or academics to travel there, just simply because you could be taken hostage, and that, includes myself also. But I did have a moment where things were pretty open. I was just very fortunate.
Great. Okay, let me throw it open to the audience. We have about 17 minutes, but we have to close down at 3 on the dot. Natalia, can we have a microphone?
Thank you, Natalia Gubenyuka, Ukrainian journalist. That's fascinating how you brought Brezhnev, because I'm recalling the recent conversation with a Ukrainian man who was from occupied territories, who was beaten by 2 young soldiers, Russian soldiers, and while trying to resonate, saying like, why are you beating me? Your life won't be better. They said, but at least people would be afraid of us. And that's quite a great motivation, but my question is, do you think that Russia is a great power, or it's great just because it's framed like the great power, and what it takes for the people to accept that they are not greater than the others, in particular in Russia? Thank you.
Well, that's a very good and interesting question, Natalia. Other empires have gone through this, right? So there have been empires that declined and accepted their diminished role, Great Britain being one of them. It was a very slow process, but eventually, I think after Suez...
Not quite dead, unfortunately, but
not
carry
quite
on.
there, not quite there. But, at least in British case, actually, Dean Acheson said about Britain that it lost an empire and never found a role. I think it's not right. I think it did find a role. It found, it had the Commonwealth, it had the European Union for a while, obviously. It had the quote-unquote special relationship with the United States, more special for Britain than for the United States, but nevertheless, whereas Russia is truly one of those powers that lost an empire but never found a role. And I think in the 1990s, you see that. You see how they're struggling with this. We used to be this great power. What is our mission now? And they're still projecting the sense of greatness. One of the fascinating periods is just to study the 1990s in the materials that are opening up, because you have leaders like Yeltsin reaching out to the Americans saying, look, we want to be your partners and we want to co-manage the world. Russia, a much diminished Russia, having this ambition to co-manage the world in the 1990s with the United States. Of course, the United States told them, mind your own business. So you have this, you have them to fall back on the projection of either historical greatness, hence the Second World War cult that you have in Russia today, or on the military power and this ability to destroy the world, which is something that becomes a prominent theme for Moscow, not with Putin, but actually with Nikita Khrushchev. Because once Nikita Khrushchev realized the awesome power of nuclear weapons, it was like, wow, everybody will be afraid of us. We will scare everybody to death, right? And Brezhnev comes around and says, well, actually, we can destroy the world, therefore it gives us special responsibility, hence we need to have arms control and various other things. So Brezhnev at least had a more sensible approach to this, whereas Putin, I think, returned to this mentality that, look, nobody can do anything to us because we're a nuclear power. Is he wrong? I would say that the experience of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and in particular the American response to that under the Biden administration and even now, but also the European response, shows that he's not entirely wrong, i.e. there's still a fear, great fear of what a direct confrontation with Russia might result in. And that continues to define Western policy. So Putin, I think, is not entirely wrong in his expectation that he can terrorize the world with his nuclear weapons.
Other questions? Tessa.
Thank you. Thank you for this so inspiring talk, both of you. Sergey, can I ask you as a historian for an autobiographical note on your own childhood growing up in Sakhalin, because I was always fascinated by Sakhalin Island, and maybe because of Chekhov, but can you explain to us how it was to experience growing up there, the end of the Soviet Union, and also what they taught you in school, if the periphery was actually good for the narrative, or if you got more information than maybe students would get in Moscow?
No, it was, no, thank you for this question. It was very isolated. It was out there where, even if you were a Soviet citizen, you would have to get a special permission to travel there because it was considered a border region. And so you would not be able to, a lot of people weren't, people would obviously travel, but it was difficult. 1989, we talked about in the previous session, miraculous year, 1989. Meant nothing. We're living in Sakhalin. I don't think anybody noticed the fall of the Berlin Wall. in Sakhalin, really didn't. But what happened is, what really changed was the opening to Japan. So things really started changing with that. Borders opened up a little bit. When I was a child at that time, growing up in the Soviet Union, we had no relationship with Japan whatsoever, but you could listen to Japanese radio, which I always found really fascinating because it was so close, and sometimes you could get Japanese cartoons if you tuned the TV in the right kind of way. And then suddenly everything changed after the Cold War, and you had the influx of Japanese technologies, cars and so on and so forth. And then came the oil boom in American companies, and things changed in this kind of way as well. But I would say that life there was and continues to be very different from life in the center of Russia. So it's not the same as living in Moscow. No, I did not have access to culture, I did not have access to museums, I did not have access to practically anything, but there was great fishing. if you could compete with bears, which is another thing.
Did you experience at all the steady penetration of Chinese business into the East?
So obviously Soviet relations with China were quite bad until the early 80s. They started to change in the early 80s, already on Brezhnev's watch, but then really improved under Gorbachev. And for a while there was this fear of Chinese economic penetration as well, and fear in particular of Chinese migration. Of course, that was a vision and the paranoia of the Soviet leaders. They just worried about all those Chinese coming across the border. Nothing happened. You had some Chinese migration into the Far East, but for a variety of reasons, it didn't really lead to any sort of living standards so low there. At this point, it's actually better for the Chinese to be in China. They're having much better time there. So there's some Chinese penetration, particularly in agricultural workers would come, but it certainly has not become some kind of a Chinese colony by any stretch of imagination.
Any other questions? Oh, all of a sudden, I've got one there about 3/5 of the way down, yes. On the edge.
Thank you very much, very interesting. I would like to ask the question that I've often asked and never got a reply to, so it may seem rather pointless to ask it again, but I'm still going to do it. I would like your opinion about the post-Putin era. Something might happen to Putin, he might fall out of a window, or he might get very ill, but there is going to be a post-Putin era. And I would like your opinion about what it will look like. Thank you.
That's a great question. Look, there's definitely going to be a post-Putin era, despite his clear fascination with organ transplants, and the idea that he wants to live to 150 is a little bit disconcerting. But yes, there is going to be a post-Putin era, and like in previous power transitions in the Soviet Union, for example, you can expect to have a bit of a power struggle in the immediate years afterwards, and you can also expect a softening of foreign policy, because the new Russian leadership are going to try to gain international legitimacy, going back to legitimacy. They really need that. And having external recognition of their legitimate rights, etc., is very important. But how do you get that? You make concessions and you ease your, maybe whether it's domestic repression or external aggression, as in the case of the war against Ukraine. So I certainly expect changes, and I think this is going to be a very important moment for the West, because it is going to be very important to engage with the Russians and see what can be salvaged. You cannot, I don't buy this idea that you can just basically build a very high fence and hope that Russia just disappears. It's not going to disappear, it's there, so we have to figure out what to do with it. And we need to pursue wise policies to be able to engage with the Russians in the right kind of way in order to perhaps both make them pay for the aggression, but also salvage a better relationship in the future.
Thank you. Other questions? Another hand there. Oh, so, we'll go there first, towards the back, yeah.
1.5 years ago, you wrote this famous, or depending on who you ask, infamous article on the talks that could have ended the war in Ukraine. Would you republish the article today? And what made you so confident? Because in my humble opinion, why should Russia have ever agreed on ending the war, in particular from today's perspective?
Right, good question. So first of all, the article obviously was highly scandalous, and despite the fact that actually it was one of the, I think it was an article of the year for Foreign Affairs last year, but there was a lot of pushback, and a lot of people pushed back, particularly because they didn't like the title. The talks that could have ended the war in Ukraine. Now, when people push back against things like that, they don't realize that authors do not come up with titles. The title is a bit of a clickbait, really. If you go into the article and you read it carefully, you will realize that the argument, from my perspective, it was me and Sam Cherub. Sam Cherub is a political scientist at RAND. From my perspective as a historian, what I wanted to do in this article is to explain what happened the best, using the information that we have at our disposal, which are documents and interviews on both the Russian and the Ukrainian side. And what we could say is that both the Russians and the Ukrainian delegations negotiated in Istanbul in earnest. There was a real back and forth, and positions shifted as a result. If you compare what the Russians came to Ukraine first, there was effectively a first draft of this, I think dated March, can't remember now, March 8th, I believe. March 8th, the Russians presented the first draft. And you compare this with the document on April 15th, 2022, you see the long distance that the Russians traveled in addressing Ukraine's various obvious concerns, because the first document was basically an ultimatum. It called for Ukraine's effectively unconditional capitulation. Now, what we could not determine whether President Zelensky and Putin actually wanted to end the war, or whether this was a way to drag it out. In other words, you have talks, and then you'll see how it goes, and basically it's an element of time wasting. We know that the delegations genuinely engaged. We don't know what Zelensky and Putin were thinking. And this is going to be a question that historians later will have to answer and will have to resolve. Would I publish this article? I would say actually this article fared very, very well. And I think it's still basically a go-to article if you want to understand what was happening in Istanbul in 2022.
Final question, Ivan, I can't see. Yes. So final question over there from someone I don't see. I do now.
Thanks for finding me. Now I took the train in 1991, early 1991, from the Trans-Mongolian, from Moscow to Beijing. And I remember as we pulled into China, my Uzbek traveling partners on the train, and as we'd pass these Chinese gray cities covered with coal dust, the Uzbeks would just mock the Chinese and would tell me that life in the Soviet Union is so much better. Look at this poor, miserable country, which is ironic because they were going to China to get consumer goods to bring back to Tashkent. But in any case, I was living in Russia in the 90s. I felt that Russians had a lot of psychological investment in feeling superior to China. So how do you feel that this partnership is going to develop in the future, and how is Russia actually going to manage being a junior partner to a far stronger China?
It's a really, really good question, and you're right. Of course, the Russians historically look down on China, and look, China is backward in their view. And there was a huge element of racism there as well. As I show in my book, there is, this really defined Soviet foreign policy towards China. So it's kind of, this idea that the Chinese were inferior, but the Soviets were European civilization and could bring culture and modernity to China, which obviously the Chinese resented for obvious reasons. Now the tables have been turned, and now it is Russia that is the junior partner. And if you go to cities like Blagoveshchensk, for example, you'll see that the Chinese side of the river is just so much more developed compared to the Russian side, which basically are still Khrushchevkas more or less. But the turning of tables did not lead to the sort of resentment that you would have expected. And I think this is partly due to the fact that the Chinese recognize and understand the historical lessons of their difficult relationship with Russia. The difficult relationship was this: the Russians looked down on them and tried to control them, etc., because they felt they were superior. Now the Chinese, they are willing even sometimes to defer to Russia. They're very respectful in their language. Xi Jinping is extremely respectful when it comes to Putin. They just do not do the sort of quasi-imperialistic policy that the Soviets were pursuing in regard to China. I think both sides have learned something from history, and they learned that if you have a bad relationship, third parties will come to exploit that and play you against one another. This is, of course, what Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon did so well in the early 1970s, and they're determined to avoid that situation, avoid that scenario. And so the Russians, or rather the Chinese, have not cracked the whip. They could have. They have a lot of economic leverage, but they have not cracked the whip. Because they value Russia as a strategic partner. They think about Russia in geopolitical terms. They think that Russia is a lightning rod. It's something that can be used to direct the Western rage. You know, they're doing this war in Ukraine. Okay, well, the Western rage is focused on that, and we can do our own business. So they think about Russia in those geopolitical terms. Do they love the Russians? I don't think so. I don't think there's great love between the Russians and the Chinese. But there's, I think there's a greater engagement at the cultural level. There's more exchange. Russians are starting to learn Chinese as well, which is an interesting thing, which I think is not a bad thing. You know, I spent 5 years. I lived in China for 5 years, and another 3 years in Mongolia, and I can say that it was an eye-opening experience for me, and I don't regret that. I think it was very, very important.
Ladies and gentlemen, there are a few copies of To Run the World out in the bookshop. Unfortunately, Sergey will not be able to sign them right now because I have to whisk him off to record a podcast. But before you get lost in the stampede to pick up those last copies of To Run the World, please, a rousing round of applause for Sergey Radchenko.
Thank you.